I'd like to call the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology to order and begin our hearing on promoting broadband jobs and economic growth through commercial spectrum auctions, and welcome all of our witnesses who are here today. Spectrum legislation presents a tremendous opportunity to promote wireless broadband, to spur economic growth, to create jobs, and generate significant revenue for the American taxpayer. This hearing will focus not only on how we might advance our goals by auctioning currently available spectrum, but also how we might create a marketplace where licenses can voluntarily return spectrum for broadband in exchange for a share of auction proceeds. The communications industry in America is in a time of massive change. Americans' voracious appetite for mobility has made wireless service an overwhelmingly popular way for Americans to stay connected. In fact, nearly 1 in 4 Americans has cut the cord, as it were, relying solely on wireless for their voice communications needs. Similarly, wireless is the fastest growing area of broadband connectivity. The convenience of mobility that moved us towards wireless voice is having the same effect in the broadband arena. Last week, we had our hearing on public safety spectrum, and I continue to have concerns that reallocating the D block rather than auctioning it may be a mistake. The Advanced Wireless Services 3 spectrum is another block already available for auction, although many believe it would best be paired with spectrum currently occupied by federal users. All of this spectrum needs to be part of our discussion. Another avenue for consideration is voluntary incentive auctions, something that both the FCC's National Broadband Plan and the President's budget identify. Current license holders, such as some television broadcasters and satellite operators, might be willing to relinquish spectrum and use the auction proceeds to fund operations of new innovative ventures. For example, the DTV transition has allowed broadcasters to transmit in high definition and add additional over-the-air channels. Additional funding could help pay for expanded mobile, internet, and even broadband offerings. We can and should act to preserve and promote this important service. I support incentive auctions, but any incentive auction in which a licensee forfeits spectrum rights must be voluntary. This is not only good spectrum policy, it is good economic policy. Incentive auctions help match willing buyers and willing sellers. If a broadcast station values its spectrum more than a potential wireless broadband provider is willing to pay, the station will not be forced off the air. However, as Mr. Ellis will attest in his testimony today, there are broadcasters interested in participating in incentive auctions. This opportunity for broadcasters presents opportunities for our nation's economy as well. Broadcasters who agree to surrender their licenses through an incentive auction, or those who choose to only return a portion of the license and channel share with another broadcaster, could provide the U.S. government with the opportunity to re-auction their licenses to wireless providers who desperately need additional spectrum to meet consumer demand. Those auctions will generate revenue for the Treasury for debt reduction. Moreover, they will help create badly needed jobs. Build out of wireless networks in an infrastructure project that requires the labor of Americans across a broad cross-section of geography, education, and skill levels. And of course, increased wireless broadband will boost productivity and create new and innovative lines of business. The wireless industry's track record for innovation is second to none. But wireless is not the sole venue for innovation. As we move forward with additional changes to the broadcast television service, we should work with broadcasters to identify regulations that are hindering additional innovation within their service. Over-the-air broadcasting remains a vital and important part of the communications infrastructure of America. Fostering its innovation is in everyone's interest. I remain confident that a properly crafted incentive auction can benefit broadcasters whether they participate or not, as well as wireless providers, the U.S. Treasury, and the American economy. So today's hearing is designed to help explore how the auctions can be structured to ensure a positive outcome for everyone involved. I thank the witnesses for their participation today. I look forward to your testimony and your responses to the questions that our subcommittee has. And with that, I would yield back my time. Well, I'll yield, let's see, we only have 36 seconds left. I'll yield back the time, and we'll go to Ms. Eshu for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to all the witnesses that are here today. I'm looking forward to your testimony and to the Q&A. Today's hearing continues our in-depth examination on spectrum reform. As we evaluate ways to promote broadband, jobs, and economic growth, we should be guided by, I think, a simple principle. Use spectrum to its maximum efficiency and be fiscally responsible in the plan that we commit to. 30 years ago, most Americans relied on over-the-air broadcasting as their only means for news, information, and entertainment. Then cable and satellite established an alternative vehicle for delivering television into the home, giving consumers access to hundreds of channels. The world is changing once again, and today broadband is enabling a new set of programming options like Hulu, Amazon Instant Video, and Netflix that can be watched at home or on the go. Voluntary incentive auctions are one such way to address the growing demand for wireless while providing a financial incentive for broadcasters wishing to give back spectrum. Legislation developed in this subcommittee, I think, should incorporate feedback from impacted stakeholders and provide the FCC with sufficient flexibility to carry out an auction and handle the repacking process. We should also consider the significant benefits of dedicating spectrum for unlicensed use. Unlicensed spectrum has unlocked tremendous innovation, and in the coming years will drive the growth of smart grid, access to patient records in hospitals, and much, much more. By one estimate, unlicensed applications could generate between $16 to $37 billion per year in economic value for the U.S. economy over the course of the next 15 years. The TV white spaces and 5 megahertz band are two areas which I hope today's witnesses will address. Our panel provides a broad range of views, and I look forward to hearing their thoughts on how best to structure a voluntary incentive auction while providing fair compensation to broadcasters who choose to relinquish their spectrum or must relocate as part of the repacking process. And with that, I will yield the balance of my time to Representative Matsui.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Eshoo, for yielding to me. And I'd also like to thank our witnesses for being with us today. Thank you very much. We all know there's a looming spectrum crisis, and we must get additional spectrum into the marketplace. The FCC should have the flexibility to structure and conduct incentive auctions that would truly maximize the economic and social values of the spectrum. I also believe that comprehensive spectrum policy moving forward should offer our innovators and entrepreneurs an opportunity to be creative and have a forum to develop advanced technologies and applications. To help spur greater innovation, I'm working on spectrum legislation that incentivizes R&D efforts and promotes unlicensed spectrum use, not only for emerging wireless technologies and applications, but also as a way to support and further advance American leadership in existing unlicensed technologies. It is important that we continue to promote policies that lead to greater innovation in the ever-evolving telecommunications and technology sectors. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of the time. And now I would recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, the Vice Chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is our responsibility to ensure that the process by which we allocate the lifeblood of wireless information delivery, spectrum, promotes the needs of broadband carriers while simultaneously recognizing the value of this spectrum to the existing license holders, not only for existing critical uses, but for the future innovations. This process must be fair, economically sound, and provide certainty and predictability to existing holders of spectrum licenses. By doing so, economic growth will lead to job creation, innovation can flourish, and critical broadcast resources will remain secure and available. This hearing is a great opportunity for us to learn more about how to best structure this process. Any spectrum auction must account for several important factors. First, we must ensure that we are not coercing existing license holder into giving up spectrum they wish to continue to utilize. If and when existing holders do choose to participate in either an auction or reallocation, not only must we compensate them fairly and be consistent with the spectrum's value to the existing holder, any repacking of spectrum should be done in such a way that the consumer's access to critical information resources is not adversely affected by interference or signal degradation. With these goals in mind, I look forward to working with my colleagues in crafting solutions. Our witnesses today here bring much expertise from across stakeholder community, and I look forward to listening and learning from them here today. Yield back.
Mr. Stearns, do you have some
Thank you,
comments?
Mr. Chairman. I'll just take a little over a minute. Last October, the FCC estimated that a spectrum deficit approaching 300 megahertz is likely by the year 2014, not very far away. And simply the benefit of releasing additional spectrum is likely to provide $100 billion to the Treasury. Not a very small figure, in fact. So I think we should, Mr. Chairman, act quickly to draft legislation that provides the FCC with authority to conduct commercial auctions so that by 2014 we'll not face this crisis of shortage. We know that the convergence of the smartphones and tablets, TVs and broadband is continuing onward, and we see that day to day. They continue to guzzle up the broadband, and so the demand for these devices is increasing. We need to get more spectrum, and I'd like to emphasize that the incentive auctions is a way to go, so it's truly voluntary, and when broadcasters are repacked, they should be able to maintain the same service areas that they originally held and be compensated for switching channels. So I look forward to our testimony, and I think everybody on the panelists should provide some recommendation of what type of flexibility the FCC should have. Should Congress specify to the FCC on how to do the auction, or should the FCC be unfettered? I think that's a key question we have today, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to have my opening statement.
Mr. Latta or Mr. Guthrie, do you have any comments opening? Ms.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And just real briefly, I thank you very much for having these hearings today. I've recently introduced legislation for a voluntary incentive auction and the revenue sharing, and when you're looking at the jobs and the technology out there, that we could be moving forward, and also additional revenue then to the Treasury to reduce the deficit. I applaud you for the hearings today. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Blackburn, did you have an opening statement you wanted to share?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do, and I will submit my full statement. For the record, I just want to say I think that when it comes to spectrum and that we have to make some bold, tough decisions. I think also one thing that we should all be focusing on a bit is the FCC has demonstrated that what they call a spectrum deficit approaching 300 megahertz is likely by 2014. We need to be looking at that and be serious in how we go about approaching this and resolving that need for spectrum. I was visiting with someone last week, and they were talking about how we will soon have 1 trillion devices attached to the broadband, and why it is so important for us as we look at the use of the spectrum to think in terms of how we accommodate, whether it is through the line or wireless, all of the use that is coming toward us. So I thank you for the hearing. I yield back.
Thank you. All time has expired for opening statements. No, we go to Mr. Waxman. I almost did that again. I'm sorry. Mr. Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since April 12, the Communications and Technology Subcommittee has held 3 hearings on the spectrum policy. Last week, we focused on public safety spectrum and needs for public safety spectrum, while this week we'll examine how we might make additional spectrum available for commercial broadband through incentive auctions. I'm pleased that Chairman Walden and Ranking Member Eshoo are working together to focus the subcommittee's attention on spectrum matters. Smart spectrum policy can help improve public safety, promote broadband, create jobs, and reduce the deficit. I know members on both sides of the aisle recognize what a rare opportunity we have to accomplish several important policy goals by enacting legislation in this area. Incentive auctions are not the only element of smart spectrum policy that we need to address. We also should consider how to utilize federal spectrum resources better, how to encourage spectrum sharing, how to maximize spectrum efficiency across all spectrum bands, and how to balance our mix of licensed and unlicensed spectrum. By authorizing the FCC to conduct incentive auctions, that should be the foundation of our spectrum policy efforts. This is a concept that has bipartisan, bicameral support. At the Energy and Commerce Committee, Representatives Barrow and Latta have both introduced measures that would grant the FCC the ability to conduct incentive auctions. It's also backed by economic experts. In April, more than 100 prominent economists with varying political perspectives wrote to President Obama to endorse incentive auctions as a good way to repurpose spectrum while minimizing transaction costs. Notably, these economists believe that Congress should give the FCC great flexibility to design appropriate auction rules to maximize the benefits of incentive auctions. They note that in 1993, Congress took the then controversial step of authorizing spectrum auctions and allowing the FCC flexibility to design how spectrum auctions should work. The result was a huge success. Since Congress authorized spectrum auctions, the increase in consumer welfare has been dramatic and the economic benefits to our nation substantial. The system implemented by the FCC has been replicated around the world. As we move forward towards authorizing incentive auctions, and I hope we will do so soon, we need to be wary about limiting the FCC's flexibility to design an efficient auction. We should take full advantage of the FCC's world-class expertise on auction design and give the agency the ability to work with auction experts to set up the best possible incentive auction. We should not micromanage the agency in this area. I recognize some are concerned about whether we can ensure that incentive auctions are truly voluntary. I remain confident that we can find a way to avoid unfairly disadvantaging broadcasters in this process, and I appreciate the broadcasters' stated willingness to work with us to figure this out. Broadcasters provide vital services that should not be interrupted or degraded. Our job should not be to focus on the specific legislative language that would provide our job should be to focus on the specific legislative language that would provide assurances to broadcasters that they are not being forced to sell spectrum in the voluntary auction. We have an excellent panel today. I look forward to hearing testimony from them. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me for this opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. We look forward to working with you and others on both sides of the aisle on this issue. Now, I think all members have had a chance for opening statements, so we will now go to start with Mr. Todd Schurz, who is the Chief Executive Officer, President, and Director of Schurz Communications Incorporated. We look forward to your testimony, and thank you for coming today. You may want to push that microphone button. And just for everybody on the panel, these microphones, for those of you in broadcast, you actually have to work very closely. Okay? If they're a foot away, we don't hear as well, and the little button should light, I think. And then the little boxes in front of you should light up and tell you as your time's running out. You'll get a yellow and then a red, and then, well, I can't tell you what happens after that. It's not pleasant.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chairman Walton, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Todd Schurz. I'm the President and CEO of Schurz Communications, based in Mishawaka, Indiana. I'm testifying today on behalf of the National Association of Broadcasters. Schurz Communications began broadcasting in 1922, which makes me a fourth-generation broadcaster. Today, we have 10 television stations, and my company has a presence in 14 states, including Michigan, California, Florida, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. The beauty of television broadcasting is its one-to-many architecture. For high-demand programming, like the Super Bowl, there is no limit to how many viewers can tune in. The same programming delivered on a broadband system would overload the network. The transition to digital television has thrown open the doors of opportunity and innovation. Whereas in analog, I can only provide a single stream of programming, today with digital, I can provide that same programming in high definition and at the same time offer additional multicast channels and mobile DTV. Hundreds of broadcasters are taking advantage of new multicast opportunities, providing viewers with niche foreign language programming, religious programming, emergency local weather information, and even high school sports. The Bounce TV network, recently launched by majority owners Martin Luther King III and Andrew Young, is the country's first broadcast network aimed at African American audiences. It's set to debut this fall on many multicast channels. Going digital has also delivered on the promise of mobile television. With mobile DTV, viewers can tune into live local news, emergency information, weather, sporting events, or entertainment programs from the convenience of their car, at the beach, wherever they may be. Today, over 70 stations are offering mobile DTV service, and hundreds more are moving forward with the nationwide rollout of mobile DTV. Since the digital television transition, our company has added local news in high definition, multilingual newscasts, and expanded weather programming in our Tornado Alley stations. All of this is available for free. And the future offers additional possibilities, such as datacasting and 3D TV. Broadcasters want to make sure that viewers continue to be the beneficiaries of broadcast innovation. And innovation is necessary for us to stay competitive with an ever-growing number of new competitors. Now remember, it was just 2 years ago that television broadcasters completed the digital television transition. As part of the DTV transition, television broadcasters returned 108 megahertz of spectrum, nearly 30% of our spectrum. This freed up spectrum for both public safety and new commercial wireless services. But as part of that give back, the FCC repacked broadcasters onto fewer channels, which is complex and disruptive for our viewers. Now, just a couple of years later, the FCC has returned to broadcasters, asking us to do it again and asking for another 40% of our spectrum. We are committed to being a part of the broadband solution, but there is only so much that the laws of physics will allow us to do without crippling our ability to serve our local communities now and in the future. Broadcasters have never objected to truly voluntary incentive auctions, but we do feel strongly that protections need to be built into the spectrum legislation to ensure the future competitiveness and viability of local television broadcasting. Here are 4 important safeguards. 1, no broadcaster should be forced to relocate to an inferior spectrum band. 2, any repacking by the FCC should protect viewers by maintaining the current reach of a broadcaster's signal. 3, no station should be subjected to increased interference. And 4, broadcasters should be held harmless from the cost of repacking. Importantly, in the drive to advance broadband and relieve network congestion, we cannot and should not focus only on the spectrum supply. There also needs to be a comprehensive examination of how we can capture more efficiencies from wireless carriers and the consumer electronics industry, including cell splitting and Wi-Fi technology, improved receivers, and migrating to voice over internet protocol. We all know that the pace of technology is unrelenting, and tomorrow's innovations will help solve many of the anticipated wireless capacity issues. In conclusion, we appreciate the committee's thoughtful and deliberate approach to the spectrum issue. Remember, once we reallocate the spectrum, once broadcasters who want to continue to provide service are repacked in a harmful way, there's no going back. We get only one shot at this. We need to do it right to ensure that viewers do not lose access to the news, entertainment, and vital emergency programming that broadcasters provide. I'm as excited about broadcasting's future as we are proud of our heritage. Our company has no plans to return our spectrum. For that reason, I ask that any spectrum legislation be crafted to protect our ability to continue to serve the viewers of our local communities. Thank you, and I'd welcome any questions.
Mr. Schurz, thank you for your testimony and for your family's long history of serving your communities. Now I'd like to go to Mr. Bert Ellis, who's president of Titan Broadcast Management. Mr. Ellis, we welcome you here today and look forward to your testimony as well.
Good afternoon, Congressmen and Congresswomen. My name is Bert Ellis, and I am the president of Titan Broadcasting. And we currently own and or operate 13 television stations. The FCC would like us broadcasters to repack down to channels 14 to 30 to free up an additional 120 megahertz of spectrum. There are several major problems with this proposal. First, there are just too many broadcast signals currently on the air in primarily the top 10 to 20 markets to repack into these 17 remaining UHF channels. Consequently, some small number of television stations, 75 by my count, must be purchased and shut down, presumably through a voluntary incentive-based auction. Now, if Dr. Connolly and the FCC can design a reverse auction system that is to their advantage, so be it, so long as the broadcaster's decision to sell or repack is still totally voluntary. And voluntary means the FCC cannot set the selling price by, for these stations via caps, via percentages, or any other such valuation restriction, only via market forces. As the chairman said, my company is, under certain circumstances, willing to sell the spectrum for some of our stations. We are open to this consideration. However, the FCC still needs to repack all the remaining stations such that the stations are not impaired financially or by a signal. Mr. Schurz has already addressed this, so I will not rehash that, but I stand by those concerns as well. But finally, in my view, the FCC needs to use this whole process to provide a win-win for the broadcast industry and Americans in general. Fortunately, the FCC and Congress does have the power to offer up two very powerful incentives to the industry that also advance the National Broadband Plan. Option number one, the FCC and Congress can either mandate or use their bully pulpit to convince the wireless carriers and the handset tablet manufacturers to incorporate mobile tuners into all new handsets and tablets. This would help the broadcast industry fast launch mobile services, and not just mobile services for personal entertainment, but also mobile services that could be the basis for a national emergency alert communications network. We have incorporated plans for just such a national emergency network into the Mobile 500 rollout plans that were announced only yesterday. Now, I've been told over and over and over again that this tuner option is DOA, but I just don't believe it. It would seem very simple to me to make this a condition of the wireless companies participating in the spectrum auctions, as well as in the AT&T-T-Mobile merger approval. And I am sure Qualcomm, to my left, would gladly make these new chips. Option two, the FCC can finance and facilitate the transition from our current 8 VSB broadcast modulation technology to OFDM. A new OFDM broadcast standard would come with three huge advantages for the FCC, the broadcast industry, and the consumer. One, the FCC. OFDM would permit the FCC to much more densely repack the broadcast stations, allowing more channels in each market to be used. Two, the broadcast industry. It will allow one broadcast channel to broadcast almost twice the current capability of 19.4 megabits. This would enable broadcasters to support a national LTE-based emergency alert network. Mobile broadcasting offers the best and fastest means for the U.S. to create such a national emergency network. And third, to the consumer, OFDM allows broadcast signals on any device to be picked up by one chip. Consequently, this chip can be manufactured in large numbers very cheaply and can be embedded in handsets, tablets, computers, and televisions. This will allow a seamless mobile viewing methodology. A person can watch a newscast, a ball game, anything on their handset, then their tablet, then their television in a seamless manner. They will not miss a frame of viewing. This is the holy grail of future mobile. This is what the consumer wants. Broadcasters have a great deal to offer, but much of the current thinking seems to want to relegate us to the technology trash bin. We want to be part of the emerging digital future. The 4, soon to be 3 maybe, major wireless carriers already control 90% of the available mobile spectrum. If you want to sell more of our broadcast spectrum to these wireless guys, then give us broadcasters the opportunity to fully compete with them on the mobile front. If they want to go down in numbers, let us get in the game with them. Do not let them close us out of the from the mobile consumer. All of us in the media business want to be in the mobile video business in order to survive and thrive in the future. And more competition is better for the consumer. The FCC needs to compensate broadcast stations to repack. By their own estimate, it will cost about $1 million per station, about $1 billion. For about $2 to $3 billion, the stations can not only be repacked, but can also switch over to this new OFDM technology. that can support a broadcast overlay for LTE, as I said. This is the time to do both, repack and upgrade our technology, and also mandate the mobile DTV chips. Then we can have a totally mobile broadband-enabled population. With such a system in place, we broadcasters can and will create an immediately accessible mobile video network for instantaneous communications to all of our citizens in the event of a local, regional, or national emergency. Mobile broadcasting was the technology that worked in Japan during their crisis. The one-to-one architecture of the cellular system failed. Mobile broadcasting worked. There is a win-win agenda here. I support such. Thank you.
Mr. Ellis, thank you for your suggestions, your testimony, and your service. Now we'll go to Mr. Christopher Gutman-McCabe, who is Vice President for Regulatory Affairs of CTIA, the Wireless Association. We appreciate your testimony today and look forward to it, and thank you for being here.
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of CTIA, thank you for the chance to speak to you today about promoting broadband, jobs, and economic growth through commercial spectrum auctions. CTIA believes these objectives are achievable and mutually reinforcing. For that reason, we urge you to act at the earliest possible date to enact legislation that will authorize incentive auctions and allow additional licensed spectrum to be made available for commercial wireless use. Today, we are the world's clear leader in wireless broadband. Although the United States is home to less than 5% of the world's population and just shy of 6% of global wireless subscribers, the U.S. claims more than 20% of global high-speed wireless broadband subscribers. This leadership helps to create a competitive advantage for the United States. But to maintain this advantage, we need to ensure that there is a sufficient pipeline of spectrum available to meet the exploding demand for wireless broadband services. We urge you to address this with dispatch, as delay puts at risk not only our world leadership in this critical industry, but also lost or delayed investment, innovation, and productivity that are critical to our nation's economy. The growth in the demand for mobile broadband and the corresponding need for additional spectrum has been well documented both by the government and respected private sector parties. Even conservative estimates project U.S. mobile data traffic to grow by a factor of more than 20 between the end of last year and 2015. This demand is being driven by consumers' migration from feature phones to smartphones and tablets that, while employing advances in spectral and computing efficiency, allow consumers to demand more and thus strain wireless networks to an unprecedented manner. The evolution of machine-to-machine communications will only exacerbate this challenge. Efficiency gains and infrastructure investment will help, but neither will be sufficient to answer the challenge we face in delivering the critical infrastructure for the economy of the 21st century. The good news is that there are ways to help meet the need for additional spectrum. By authorizing incentive auctions and repacking the bands allocated for television broadcasting, by directing NTIA to facilitate access to bands currently occupied but often underutilized by government, and by enacting improvements to the spectrum relocation process, Congress can provide the wireless industry with a path to help America stay ahead of its Asian and European competitors in this critical industry. Taking these steps will produce manifest benefits to our nation. The last two auctions produced more than $32 billion for the United States Treasury. While I cannot project what future auctions might produce, the bands discussed in my testimony have significant value and would likely be highly desired at auction. Auction revenues, however, are just one of the benefits that flow from facilitating the movement of spectrum to its highest and best use. Once spectrum is in the hands of those who value it, significant investment, entrepreneurial activity, and productivity will result. Since 2006, CTIA's carrier members have been directly responsible for nearly $111 billion in network investment. Because a dollar invested in wireless deployment is estimated to result in as much as $7 to $10 in expanded GDP, this past investment has contributed to keeping the U.S. economy afloat during a difficult economic period. Going forward, wireless investment and this multiplier will be critical to helping create sustainable economic growth in the United States. Perhaps more importantly, unlocking additional spectrum can help to create new employment opportunities. From the forging of steel for new towers and the construction of additional cell sites to the development of new network equipment and the writing of our next must-have application, bringing spectrum to market will create thousands of American jobs. Some economists estimate that the job growth related to the investment in next-generation wireless technologies could be as high as 200,000 new positions. and that estimate does not account for positions in adjacent fields as wireless becomes a key input into areas such as healthcare, energy, education, transportation, and logistics. Enabling the next generation of service and ensuring our world leadership in wireless should be a national imperative. Done properly, we can make needed spectrum available for ubiquitous mobile broadband, treat relocated broadcasters and government users fairly, produce significant revenue for the U.S. Treasury, and help grow the U.S. economy. CTI looks forward to working with you to achieve these objectives, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gutman-McCabe. We appreciate your testimony. We're now going to turn to Dr. Michelle P. Connolly, who is Associate Professor of the Practice, Department of Economics at Duke University. And we look forward to your comments, Dr. Connolly, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Chairman Walden and Ranking Member Eshoo and the other members of the subcommittee. My name is Michelle Connolly. I'm an Associate Professor of the Practice at the Department of Economics at Duke University. I also served as the Chief Economist at the FCC in 2006 to 2007, and then again in 2008 to 2009. I'd like to note that I was serving under a Republican administration, so my support for this proposal has nothing to do with my political affiliation, but simply because as an economist, I believe that this is a great gain economically and socially for our economy. And it is in that capacity that I am testifying today. From this perspective, whenever we're looking at policy, we want to make sure that the gains of choosing this new policy outweigh any costs to our economy and to our society. And specifically here, we're concerned about the cost to the broadcasters and the cost to the people who rely on over-the-air broadcasts. So when I'm looking at this, I want to bring a little bit of information to the discussion. Firstly, we know that over-the-air viewing is done by less than 10% or less of the current TV viewing population. So we're talking about a small and declining population. Secondly, the two of the three options that would be provided to broadcasters do not involve cessation of over-the-air broadcasting. So this would minimize any impact on television viewers. And thirdly, with an incentive auction, broadcasters will only participate if the benefits to them outweigh the costs. And to that extent, I think this will help minimize any costs to implementing this plan. And by costs, I mean welfare costs. In terms of the benefits, there has been a lot of macroeconomic evidence that suggests that information communications technology has a great benefit to our macro economy. In the late 1990s, several studies confirmed that labor at between 56 to 67% of labor productivity growth could be attributed to information communications technology. And then from 2000 to 2006, that estimate was about 38%. One thing to note is that when firm-level studies have been done, the gains in terms of productivity are not equally spread. So gains in terms of productivity are specific to certain communities who are able to take advantage, specific to certain industries and certain communities who are able to take advantage of broadband. That's on the production side. On the consumption side, of course, this is nothing, all the gains are to consumers equally, and there is no region specificity to it. I also want to talk a little bit about incentive auctions, simply because this is an area that is very complicated. I still don't understand it entirely, and I thought it might be useful to give a little bit of background on what is really being proposed here. So the idea is that there would first be what economists would call a reverse auction for broadcasters. And in this, the FCC would specify certain actions that could be taken. They've been discussed before. And the broadcasters would offer bids for being willing to undertake these different auctions should the bid be accepted. So if the bid is accepted, they would be required to then undertake that action. If the bid is not accepted, they would not be required to take one of those three actions. And I think that this is useful for the broadcasters because this is what makes it a voluntary action. I was asked by the committee to try and estimate a possible range of bids that broadcasters might make. I am smart enough to know that my estimate will be incorrect. But I would estimate based on the fact that they have these options that the range might be in the range of about $0.05 per megahertz pop at the low end to maybe 0.08 megahertz pop on the high end. This is assuming that there is sufficient competition in the auction, and this is I think a key point. So there will be markets where there might be a broadcaster in a channel that's in the key area that we need to have contiguous spectrum. The FCC must be allowed to move people involuntarily out of that spectrum to another location, because otherwise you will get holdouts. There won't be enough competition. Someone knows that they're placed strategically, then they can bid 5 times their valuation in an attempt to extract that extra money, because then they know if they don't get their bid, they won't be able to be moved, and then the whole auction will have served for no purpose. So the reason why the FCC is requesting that after the bidding process occurs that they be allowed to relocate people who are still located in that key region and compensate them economically for the costs of the move so that they aren't burdened by that, is because without that you will not get a true auction. You will not get a true competition. Even with that, there may be other things that might interfere with the bids, but if we don't have that, then you will not get true valuation bids. And there are no two ways about that. So I think that is a crucial thing to mention. The last thing is the forward auction. Once this occurs, we can estimate a supply curve that we would need to generate the amount of spectrum, contiguous spectrum, that the FCC would want. At that point, there's the forward auction. I assume that the range of values would be at least on par with the 700 megahertz spectrum auction that we had recently. So the range might be anywhere from $0.03 per megahertz pops to up to $3.86 per megahertz pop. That's a huge range, which shows you the markets matter. But one key thing is the more rules that are imposed on the usage for the winning bids, the lower the valuation will be. And any rules that increase uncertainty over the usage will lower the value. So overall, I think the revenue resources to the government can be large, but dwarfing any revenue to the government, I think, is the economic value to our economy, and I think that will outweigh any of the gains that the government may have in revenue, but those are also good, of course.
Thank you, Dr. Connolly. We appreciate your comments. Mr. Brenner, we're going to go to you next, Vice President, Government Affairs for Qualcomm Incorporated. Thank you for being here, and proceed with your testimony, sir.
Good afternoon, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member.
Okay, now you got to push the button and bring the mic closer. There we go.
Good afternoon, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. It's a special honor for me to testify here this morning. 30 years ago to the day, I began working as an intern to this very subcommittee. What a great experience that was for a college student. I'm here today along with my colleagues Alice Turnquist and John Kuzin on behalf of Qualcomm, a company that didn't exist 30 years ago. 5 years after my internship here, Qualcomm was formed. Today, Qualcomm is the world's leading manufacturer of chips for cell phones, smartphones, and other wireless devices. The policies pursued by this subcommittee, in particular the move to spectrum auctions in the early 1990s, the reallocation of spectrum for the first PCS auctions, and the DTV transition have helped fuel the enormous growth in the American wireless industry. At Qualcomm, we spend over $2 billion each year in research and development to invent the most spectrally efficient technologies, to achieve the greatest capacity and best performance from every sliver of spectrum, licensed and unlicensed. We know that spectrum is precious and expensive based on our own experience with spectrum auctions. Although our main business is developing wireless technologies, licensing them to other companies, and selling chips based on those technologies, we've purchased licensed spectrum in auctions held in the United States, the United Kingdom, and India to facilitate the deployment of our new technologies. Qualcomm's technologies are used in the 3G and 4G devices that Americans just can't get enough of. We all want our mobile devices to work all the time and wherever we happen to be, and that requires the use of licensed spectrum. Let me explain why I say that. We make chips that support Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and other unlicensed technologies to provide wireless connectivity in local areas, such as inside homes or on college or corporate campuses. In those settings, these chips enable wireless traffic to be offloaded from the licensed spectrum that wireless carriers use for their 3G and 4G networks. This is an important and growing business for vendors like Qualcomm, and we're excited about it. Just this week, we announced a new line of Wi-Fi chips using spectrum in the 2.4 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, and 60 gigahertz bands. But to provide ubiquitous, wide-area wireless coverage all over the nation on a cost-effective and interference-free basis, licensed spectrum is required. And that brings me to the topic of today's hearing, because there isn't enough licensed spectrum available to keep pace with the exploding demand for mobile broadband. The FCC's October 2010 report found that by 2014, total U.S. mobile data traffic is likely to be 35 times the 2009 level. We're working on many new wireless technologies, but we don't have any technology on the drawing board that can increase capacity 35 times. More licensed spectrum is needed. The FCC doesn't have nearly enough new spectrum in its inventory to meet this gap. To promote broadband, jobs, and economic growth, we've got to close this gap. A number of steps must be taken and are being taken in parallel to help solve the spectrum crunch. These steps include things that the private sector is doing, such as developing and deploying new technologies, and things the government's working on, such as reallocating underutilized U.S. government spectrum. But these steps won't be nearly sufficient to solve the spectrum crunch. To do that, it's crucial that Congress enact legislation to allow the FCC to conduct voluntary incentive auctions to reallocate more licensed spectrum for mobile broadband. The legislation that we support would allow the FCC to conduct a two-sided auction composed of sellers who voluntarily decide to sell their spectrum because they think it would be worth more to a mobile broadband provider, and buyers who want to use the spectrum for mobile broadband. No one would be forced to participate as a seller or a buyer in a voluntary incentive auction. But under current law, there's no way for the FCC to get the spectrum out of the hands of the sellers who are willing to sell and into the hands of the mobile broadband buyers. Current law permits a TV station owner to sell its spectrum only to someone else who will use the spectrum to run a TV station. A TV station owner cannot sell its spectrum to a buyer so that the buyer can use it to provide mobile broadband. The legislation would allow the FCC to run a two-sided auction with all the station owners who want to sell on one side and all the mobile broadband providers or new entrants who want to buy on the other. Qualcomm, both on our own and as a member of a group of companies who sell wireless equipment, including Alcatel-Lucent, Apple, Cisco, Ericsson, Intel, Nokia, and Research in Motion, urges Congress to pass legislation to give the FCC authority to conduct voluntary incentive auctions to free up much-needed additional licensed spectrum for mobile broadband. Now, our group includes companies that compete against one another in the marketplace all the time. We make equipment using both licensed and unlicensed spectrum. But we all agree on 3 points. First, the spectrum crunch is real. Second, more licensed spectrum is necessary to solve the spectrum crunch. And third, authorizing the FCC to conduct voluntary incentive auctions is essential to solving the spectrum crunch. Passage of legislation authorizing voluntary incentive auctions would be a win-win-win-win. The first win would be for the sellers in a voluntary incentive auction. Those who decide that their spectrum is more valuable for mobile broadband than in its current allocation will win because the legislation would allow them to sell. The second win is for the buyers. The buyers will win because they're going to get the additional licensed spectrum for mobile broadband so they can keep pace with consumer demand. They need the certainty and speed of an FCC-conducted incentive auction in which the auction itself efficiently and quickly aggregates spectrum. The third win would be for the U.S. Treasury. Voluntary incentive auctions will raise significant revenues without raising anyone's taxes or cutting any programs. And finally, the fourth win is the most important win of all. The real winners will be the American public. Mobile broadband has the potential to improve so many facets of American life. Giving the FCC authority to conduct voluntary incentive auctions is essential. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brenner, both for your testimony and for your internship, although I was not here to enjoy that. We're going to go now to Mr. Feld. Harold Feld is the Legal Director for Public Knowledge. We appreciate your input on this matter. We look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Before you start, I'm going to just, they're going to ring bells here for a vote, a 15-minute vote. We're going to have you finish your testimony, and then when you're done, we'll plan to resume at about 1:25. So that'll give everybody a little break here before we go into Q&A. Mr. Feld, please continue.
Yes. My thanks to you, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Ranking Member, and the subcommittee. I am Legal Director of Public Knowledge. I am pleased to speak to you this morning on behalf of the Public Interest Spectrum Coalition about buttons and buttonholes. Buttons are tangible objects They are things that people easily understand and think about. Buttonholes are a designated empty space. Most people don't think about the importance of buttonholes when they're buttoning their clothes, but without those empty spaces, you're not going to keep your coat closed. You need both. That's what I'm here to talk about in terms of spectrum policy, which is the empty spaces in the spectrum, the white spaces, particularly in the broadcast spectrum. The policy objectives that we've all talked about here today of encouraging innovation, increasing economic activity, which helps to reduce the deficit, as well as improving all of our lives. All of these things are critically important, and we can achieve them, but we must not look at this just through the lens of a Congressional Budget Office score. In fact, I will state further that if we focus only on raising revenue, or more precisely, what we think sitting here now, years out from an auction, a very complicated structure that we think will raise revenue, the spectrum crisis will become a spectrum Armageddon, resulting in higher costs, stifled innovation, and reduced global competitiveness. The worst thing that could happen is, what if they gave an incentive auction and nobody came because we structured it poorly? White spaces are unique in spectrum policy. They've been enthusiastically supported by Republican FCC chairmen and commissioners and today's Democratic chairmen and commissioners. White spaces exist without preconceived uses and so are open to any entrepreneur or technologist with a good idea. They are the most deregulatory approach to spectrum policy we have. As FCC Commissioner McDowell said, the Commission's actions approving TV white spaces help to bring more broadband to consumers as quickly as innovation rather than as quickly as government will allow. The results have been spectacular for the U.S. economy. The short history of unlicensed spectrum has allowed the development of what were considered junk bands to yield tens of billions of dollars in economic gains and activities. The unlicensed spectrum now being considered in the prime broadcast bands promises to surpass that previous success. This is truly unlicensed 4G. Allowing for additional allocation of national unlicensed spectrum under the 1 gigahertz band with its superior characteristics of penetration and long distance, allow for the creation of gigabit capacity wireless LANs in offices, schools, high-density residential areas, mesh networks capable of many miles of coverage at a fraction of the cost of current Wi-Fi technology. Such gains don't show up in a CBO score, but they result in increased revenues for the federal government through investment, job creation, and economic productivity on an annual basis. Rural areas will be able to be served with high-capacity wireless broadband service. Low barriers to entry for unlicensed allow these rural providers to serve their communities without winning licenses at auction, which they cannot afford to do. Indeed, areas that cannot be profitably served with licensed spectrum because of the cost of winning licenses are now being served with existing Wi-Fi without universal service subsidies, and will be better served and more broadly served with white spaces spectrum. Already we are starting to see the fruits of projects like these in places as diverse as Claudeville, Virginia, with a population of 916, to the much larger city of Houston. In order for this future to come about, for there to be a spectrum for smart grid coordination, machine-to-machine communication, inventory tracking, and the rest, Congress has to make certain that the white spaces are protected by giving the FCC discretion in structuring and conducting auctions. The investors and companies that are building this technology today must believe there is a future for this here in the United States. The United Kingdom is also looking at white spaces technology, as are China and Brazil, and if investors and companies do not believe there is a future here for this innovative new technology, they will take their investment and their jobs elsewhere. Providing the FCC flexible authority to conduct incentive auctions and allowing the agency to pursue a broad approach to spectrum policy that is not exclusively tied to raising revenue will be the most effective means of promoting broadband, job creation, and economic growth. I just want to add that this is not an either-or. Rarely in policy do we have a chance to have it all. We can keep broadcasting as a vital service for this country. We can have significant new license for auction, and we can have a vibrant white spaces which will provide us with exciting new technologies for the benefit of all Americans. Mr. Brenner just says he doesn't have a technology right now that would allow them to increase their capacity by 35 times. I don't have one either, but by creating a test bed, a place where these technologies can develop at very low cost and be deployed quickly and effectively, such as the white spaces, I have a very good suspicion of where that technology will come from. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Feld, thank you very much for your comments as well. We appreciate the testimony of all of our witnesses. We're in the middle of a vote now, so again, please plan to return no later than 1:25, and we'll resume the hearing at that point for questions from the members. With that, we stand in recess. We'll call the subcommittee back to order, and I think we had concluded testimony from all of the witnesses prior to our recess for the vote on the House floor. I anticipate another vote in about 45 minutes or so. I'm going to start with first round of questions, and I want to address the first questions I have to Mr. Schurz and Mr. Ellis, and would ask if you could elaborate on some of the efforts by broadcasters to bring new and innovative services to the broadcast spectrum. Because one of the purposes of this hearing was really to evaluate, since DTV conversion, and all what's happening out there in the marketplace. What are you able to do? And I know, Mr. Ellis, you touched on this a bit, but I also like to explore what the hurdles are in the way of innovation in the spectrum that you have going forward. So if you could each take a minute or so just to kind of address what you're doing with it now and what you think you could do with it.
I think what we've done with it now in almost all of our markets, we have multicast channels serving different audiences. We have 3 stations. 2 are right in the middle of Tornado Alley. 1 is on the edge. All of them do a 24/7 weather channel with regular forecasts, so people who are very interested in the weather can always get that. What's also happened, the DTV transition happened 2 years ago. Mobile television, the standard was developed with that. Both Mr. Ellis and I are involved in those efforts. And so you're seeing that just starting now, a little over 70 stations doing mobile television. But I think the other thing is I don't want to not talk about high definition in terms of the clarity and the quality of the picture and what that means for our constituents. And to do high definition local news takes a lot of bandwidth, but it's also a great consumer value proposition.
Mr. Ellis, do you want to use a minute or so to comment? New technologies.
The company we're putting together, this time, this is my 3rd broadcast group. The first couple groups, I bet on the emergence of new programming. That was the trend I was trying to follow. This time we're betting on the emergence of new technologies. The mobile technology is the most unique and different technology for broadcasters. That's where, if to use the sports analogy, go where the puck is going. Mobile is where it's going. We're spending an awful lot of time on that, and the inhibition to that business is the ability to get, a signal into the mobile device. This is where the consumer's going. We want to be able to access that device.
All right, Mr. Brenner, I want to go to you because Mr. Ellis, I believe, mentioned OFDM and the ability to put chips in. Tell me what that would take and whether there would be acceptance of that in the market.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what Mr. Ellis is referring to, Chairman Walden. OFDM refers to an air interface that is at the core of long-term evolution, LTE, which is the 4G technology. OFDM is also used in Wi-Fi. OFDM is a modulation technique, and so it can mean all kinds of different things. I think what Mr. Ellis was suggesting is that Qualcomm would incorporate some kind of mobile DTV capability into our chips. Obviously, we look very hard at the business pros and cons of adding a new capability to our chips. Our chips support multi-frequency bands, multiple technologies, and we strive to pack the most power into our chips at the least cost.
Is that a capability you have now today to put mobile TV in a chip?
No, we've looked at it. It's been, mobile DTV has been talked about. I looked back through my emails since at least 2007 was the first announcement about it, and we've looked at it extensively. We haven't seen a business case for it in our end. Whenever we consider putting a new technology into our chips, Chairman Walden, it's a very iterative process. We go back and forth with the device manufacturers, with the carriers, and with application providers. We just don't make that decision in a vacuum, and it's not mature. We just don't see demand.
All right, Mr. Ellis, do you want to comment briefly on that?
In essence, if the carriers are not going to pay Qualcomm to put this thing in their chip, he's not going to make it.
Well, Mr. Brenner?
That's a little too simple, quite frankly. So it's true, someone is going to have to give us a return on our investment when we put a new capability into our chips, but there's a web of relationships. There are folks who make devices. There are folks who come up with applications. we are also in a highly competitive market. If I don't put a capability at Qualcomm, I shouldn't say when Qualcomm decides to pass on a capability, we consider very carefully the competition. Qualcomm is the leading chipset manufacturer, but it's hyper competitive. So it's a little too simple to just say the carriers won't pay us. We have to see a business case to make a rate of return.
I want to go to Dr. Connolly now on a different issue. I'm trying to get a rough range of what this spectrum is worth. You say in your testimony the similar spectrum was sold for between 3 cents and $3.86 per megahertz pop, as I understand it. That's correct?
Yes.
Yeah. With approximately 300 million people in the country, that means that even on the low end, each megahertz of a licensed spectrum could raise $9 million, and on the high end, each megahertz could raise $1 billion. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. My time has expired. I would turn to the gentlelady, my ranking member, Ms. Eshoo, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank each one of the witnesses. I think you did a terrific job coming from where each of you is coming from, but it was really valuable testimony. To Mr. Feld, I loved your button and buttonhole analogy. I think we will remember that one for a long time. In your view, how much spectrum is needed to make the white spaces commercially viable for applications like smart grid and RFID tagging?
Well, the most important thing is to ensure that there is white spaces available, particularly in the largest urban markets, because that is what is going to drive economies of scale, is the ability for people to put this into their laptops and their Wi-Fi routers. In terms of an amount, the National Broadband Plan said we would like to have 20 megahertz of contiguous, pure, unlicensed spectrum. That would be real nice. But the beauty of unlicensed is it's a technology. You don't need that. As long as you have at least 1 or 2 available channels in the largest urban markets and sufficient, by which I mean not directly next to a broadcaster so you could use full power, and then sufficient in the rest of the country, which I think is not where the challenge is, there will be interest in developing and investing in this technology.
Thank you. To Mr. Ellis, is Titan Broadcasting planning to offer mobile broadcasting, and what's your assessment of the potential market demand for this type of service?
Yes, we do intend to offer mobile broadcasting, and our assessment, depends on whether the consumer can actually see our signal on a mobile device. So we have to figure out whether it's whether you're going to start with the handset, which is controlled by the wireless carriers. Do you go to the laptop? Do you go to the in-car device? And how do you get the mobile consumer to actually see our signal?
Now, you stated in your testimony that you're testifying as a broadcaster that may sell off the spectrum of some of your stations under the right conditions. Can you tell us what the right conditions are in your view?
The right price.
There you go. Everybody has their price, right? And to Mr. Gutman-McCabe, thank you for your testimony and the work that CTIA does. The DTV transition freed up spectrum in the 700 megahertz band that's been auctioned, but in some cases has yet to be deployed on a commercial basis. I think it's Mr. Barrow that has legislation that also mentions as part of the bill that there has to be an inventory done. I'm concerned about those who have purchased spectrum and have yet to use it 3 years after the auction was completed. So while we know that the wireless usage is growing at an exponential rate, how do we determine future spectrum needs when there's still spectrum sitting unused?
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman. That's sort of a broad question, and I'll take it piecemeal if you don't mind. First of all, while the 700 megahertz auction was completed a little while back, it wasn't cleared until about a year ago. And it takes time to, Mr. Brenner and Qualcomm and companies like that and Ericsson that do the infrastructure need to make sure that the spectrum is available and cleared, and they begin the process of developing technology to implement on the network side and on the handset
What's the
side.
average length of time to prepare what the spectrum that's bought to bringing it, to making use of it on the market?
Sure, and I guess it depends upon if their standards have been developed, but it could be, a year to 3 to 4 years. And you must keep in mind that these companies spend tens of billions of dollars. The last two auctions raised $33 billion. So they need to answer to Wall Street. They need to have a return on their investment. And they do move forward, and they move forward, really quickly. In the last 10 years since I've been at CTIA, we've gone from analog to digital to third generation, and now we're looking at fourth generation deployments, all in a 10-year period. As far as your question about how do we determine what the future need is in terms of spectrum, whether it's Kleiner Perkins in your area or the folks in Silicon Valley or the Informa Group, or you could sort of go on and on, they've all suggested that there will be upwards of a 35 times increase in demand. And we've tried to simplify that. I've tried to simplify that in my mind. And the simplest example I have is if someone came to you and said that California was going to experience a 35 times increase in the amount of cars on its roads, after you picked yourself up off the floor, I think we would think, okay, what can we do in terms of driving efficiencies? What do we have in terms of new roads planned? And that's what we're asking Congress is we can work on the efficiency side of the equation. We can implement picocells and femtocells. We need help with the roads, and for our roads are our spectrum. And we need help preparing for that tremendous increase, which is happening. I mean, we say preparing. Data traffic doubled from 2009 to 2010. And so we're seeing that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We now go to the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee, Mr. Terry. Before I do that, Mr. Kinzinger has a document he'd like to put in the record with unanimous consent from Radio Inc. regarding radio stations involved in helping residents in Joplin after the tornadoes, Clear Channel especially. So,
thank you,
Mr. Kinzinger. Without objection, that'll be in the record. Mr. Terry.
Thank you. So, Mr. Schurz, despite your affinity for Notre Dame.
Yes, sir.
I think Mr. Ellis probably answered this very bluntly, but I think a case has been made that more spectrum is needed. TV stations have spectrum, and as I said in my opening, it's important that there's not a taking of your spectrum, that it has to be voluntary. But what will it take to get you, I'm not negotiating here, but you on behalf of others generally, define voluntary for me? What is it going to take so that you would volunteer to give up some of your spectrum?
The definition of voluntary means that there are no negative ramifications for participating or for not participating. So I think the FCC can design such an auction. My concern principally is that for those people who choose not to participate, that you, and kind of the things I chatted about in my statement in terms of no one being forced to relocate to an inferior spectrum band, that all viewers can keep seeing the channels and stations they see now, that no station is subject to increased interference, and that broadcasters should be held harmless from the cost of repacking. When I never heard the term win-win-win-win before today's hearing, and I like that term. I think what we're looking for is that people who want to stay in the business, it's don't lose. And really, it's not the broadcasters, it's our viewers and our communities. Let me also add to the don't lose that if there are spectrum fees and other costs, I think that is probably not in the spirit of voluntary.
Such as?
Such as that if we choose not to participate in the auction, repacking is involuntary. We understand that. We'd like to have the safeguards and protections on a going forward basis so there's no harm to the business and to the viewers and communities. But we certainly don't expect or want to see increased fees, spectrum fees, if we choose not to participate.
And how do you answer Dr. Conley's statement that if there isn't some mechanism to force holdouts that it will actually degrade the value of the spectrum that may be auctioned off. Do you agree that that could happen?
From all the discussions I've seen about the way the auction is being considered, and there is no definitive auction yet, but there's a lot of discussion. My expectation is I think that they will find a way that would be able and that you would limit holdouts. But, you know, the question is, Mr. Ellis is here because they said, gee, you might sell, and he said that. You know, people ask how much spectrum, who's selling. No one knows the answer to that question.
Dr. Conway, why don't we work through this a little bit more? How do you see that we can provide enough incentives, the win-win-win or not lose win-win, and not have a situation where we have to engage in a taking?
If the incentive, if the reverse auction is correctly designed, the broadcasters will only participate if they win. No one is going to participate and not win, because, and you know, that's by definition. And they can list different prices at which they're willing to do different things. So they may be willing to do one thing and they offer a certain price. They may be completely unwilling to do another thing, so they offer, you know, a very exorbitant price that they know won't be accepted, or simply refuse to participate in that option. The costs of any repackaging are, at least from what I hear, the FCC is offering to cover those. And so as long as what they are bidding on is well specified, then by definition, if their bid is accepted, they will win.
Right. But we talk about, and you look at any development, and you always see that one little old house on the corner because that person wouldn't sell out.
Right. No, and that's why we do need the ability to relocate, because they will hold out. And even, well, there's a possibility of holdout. There's also a possibility that if you are when you're bidding within a market, you are competing against the other broadcasters in that market. So if someone is not in the range that they know they're trying to empty, they are not true competitors to those in the range that they're trying to vacate. So by making relocation possible, you might have someone, say, in channel 21 who's willing to give up their location, their spectrum, go off the air or share or go somewhere else. And if someone in channel 40 is unwilling to, then 21 can sell their spectrum their rights to that spectrum, and then we can move someone to channel 21. So it means that more broadcasters within a given market will be competing for these bids to vacate spectrum. And by having that forced relocation, then the other people outside that key band become competitors. So not only is it an issue of holdout, but just general competition. The more competition there is, the more the bids are going to become true valuations for the broadcasters themselves. So it's not just for the one holdout. It's a general statement of overall competition in the bids.
Thank you. Mr. Dingell, Chairman Emeritus of the Committee, we turn to you now for 5 minutes.
Thank you for your courtesy, and I want to thank the distinguished gentlewoman from California, Ms. Matsui. Thank you. This is not the first time we have visited this question. In earlier hearings, I've expressed my strong doubt that such auctions can in fact be truly voluntary. A great source of my alarm comes from the National Broadband Plan itself, where it states at page 79 that the government's ability to reclaim, clear, and re-auction spectrum is the ultimate backstop against market failure and is an appropriate tool when the voluntary process stalls entirely. I would note that we are looking at this against a lot of actions by the Commission and the Office of Management and Budget, which have taken place without us having a real understanding of what spectrum is going where and being used by who and sat upon by who else. So this seems to imply that the Commission's action could be forcefully taking the spectrum away from broadcasters if too few or none at all participate in the voluntary spectrum auctions. Now, to all witnesses, starting with Mr. Schurz, yes or no? Would you support such action by the Commission? Yes or no?
Which action?
Taking the spectrum forcefully from broadcasters.
No.
Mr. Ellis?
No.
Next
We
witness.
support voluntary auctions.
Ma'am? Yes or no?
Auctions, yes.
And you, sir?
I always talk about voluntary incentive auctions.
And sir?
Voluntary auctions.
Only. All right. Now, to all witnesses again, do you agree that broadcasters who are willing to participate in an incentive auction should be permitted to do so in exchange for a fair share of such auctions proceeds and set the reserve price of the spectrum it wishes to auction? Yes or no? Mr. Sherman?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Ellis?
Yes.
Ma'am? Yes or no?
Who defines fair proceeds?
Well, I'm not quite sure I can, but
That's the question. So I would say no, because I don't think anyone can define that other than by the bid value.
thank you. Next witness?
I'm sorry to just raise a quibble here, but the use of the term reserve price, I don't quite understand.
Well, I'm assuming that the reserve price is the price that would be fixed by the Commission as the price below which no auction would take place and no sale would take place. Yes or no?
Okay, can I just clarify, Congressman Dingell? The reason why I'm asking is normally I have the same understanding of a reserve price. I've bid in 3 auctions over the years, and there's an aggregate price for the entire auction that the auctioneer sets. It has nothing to do with the individual bid, any bid.
Is limited, please. Yes or no? Or we'll put you down as in doubt.
I'm not sure.
Next witness.
Depends on what result you want.
All right. To all witnesses, in other words, if the FCC is overly restrictive in how re-auctioned spectrum can be used, we'll end up with a fine mess on our hands, just like the auction of the D block. Am I correct in that? Starting with you, Mr. Schurz.
Yes.
Yes or no? Mr. Ellis?
Yes.
Next witness?
Yes, you're potentially correct.
Ma'am, if you please.
Yes.
Sir?
Yes.
Next witness?
Yes.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now, to all witnesses again, similarly, the goal of any incentive auction, in addition to fairness to those who surrender the spectrum, should be to maximize the revenue to the Treasury. Yes or no? Starting with Mr. Schurz.
Yes.
Mr. Ellis?
No.
That should be a significant part of it, yes.
Ma'am?
No.
Sir?
Yes, a significant part.
Last witness?
Absolutely not.
All right, now I would like to explore this channel relocation just a bit more. Now, to Mr. Schurz and Ellis, both of you have considerable technical experience as broadcasters. Are my concerns about shifting from UHF to VHF valid? And I want to say that I have fears that doing so might restrict the geographic reach of a given broadcaster. Second, I think going from UHF to VHF will impair the broadcaster's ability to transmit digital signals. So, are my concerns about shifting from UHF to VHF valid? Yes or no?
Yes, I know our company's had specific instances of that, no question.
Mr. Ellis?
Yes, VHF does not work.
Now, again to Mr. Schurz and Mr. Ellis. Further, do you believe that reducing a broadcaster's ability to transmit digital signals puts it at a disadvantage vis-a-vis the other content providers? Yes or no?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Mr. Ellis?
If digital means an over-the-air broadcast signal only, yes, we are disadvantaged to the wireless providers.
All right, to all other witnesses, with Messrs. Schurz and Ellis's response in mind. Do you believe that it's fair to broadcasters to require that they move from the UHF band to the VHF band, yes or no? Starting with our next witness.
I think there's a difference between the upper and lower VHF bands, a pretty significant difference, and I think that's a difficult question that we can work through as part of this process. There are a large number of broadcasters currently operating in both bands.
You can't say that it's you can't say sitting there that it's fair at this time.
Well, Congressman, there are a large number of broadcasters operating in both of those bands at this moment and doing well.
But if they've already shifted, well, we'll put you down as a dot. Next witness, please.
Then, did you have another witness, Mr. Dingell, that was going to dare answer because we're over the clock here?
Well, I'm willing to forego. I just want everybody to know that we're not walking into any tea party here. Thank you for your courtesy.
Although some of us have a time or two. Mr. Stearns, we're going to yield to you for 5.
Let me ask each of you, and I think this is sort of basic to start the question off, and I'll just start to Mr. Schwartz. Do you think before we do any auction off any the spectrum that we should do an inventory, just write on down?
As a businessman, before we determine where we need to go, we always start with where we are. Yeah, I think an inventory is a good idea.
Mr. Ellis, we should do a spectrum inventory first? Before?
Yes, but I think it can be done in a weekend.
In a weekend? Okay, next.
Yes, sir. This is not that complicated.
Okay, next.
I don't think it needs to be done prior to an incentive auction process.
So your answer is no. Okay. No. Dr. Conley?
My answer would be no.
No. Mr. Brenner?
No.
Ms. Feld?
No.
Okay. Now, let's say we do have a spectrum inventory, and you find out, who has what and what they use. Do you think it's important in this layout that we determine how effectively the spectrum that they have is being used and what bands aren't yet deployed and how long until deployment? Is that an important? I mean, some of you don't think we should do a spectrum, but it seems to me that if we did a spectrum inventory, we could find out how efficiently it's being used. I think members of Congress want to know that. Mr. Schultz, do you agree with that, that if we did a spectrum inventory, we would want to find out how efficiently it's being used and what bands aren't yet deployed and how long until they're deployed?
I think that what we're looking at right now is not only the total amount of spectrum, but and no question how efficiently it's used. I think there's a question on how one defines that. Broadcasters have 6 megahertz. We use the 6 megahertz. So there could be a lot of quibbling over the details. But, yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Okay. Mr. Ellis?
As a prudent businessman, I think you should always know how you're using your product.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, our concern isn't with an inventory. It's that the suggestion that you might need to do it before you move forward with incentive auctions. And so,
well, that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, so we believe a solid, legitimate inventory of the government side of the equation, the commercial side, is fine.
Which would include how effectively it's being used.
Yes, although I think we would all share concerns about who would define that and how it would be defined. I mean, in our case...
Is it hard to define?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Conley?
I agree completely that I have nothing against doing an inventory and trying...
I mean, you folks have said no, but
I disagree with conditioning.
I think it's axiomatic. You're just trying to decide how efficiently it's being used and what bands are yet deployed and how long. I think those are important questions we should know.
But I would not condition the incentive auctions on doing that first because I know that can take years. And the value of the spectrum for our economy...
Now, Mr. Ellis says it can take a weekend.
Well, I don't know if he's worked in the government.
I'm definitely not working in government.
Touche. All right, Mr. Brenner?
If I could...
Wait, no, Mr. Brenner first.
So I want to be clear, Congressman Stearns, there should be an inventory and we should
But you said no.
I don't think we should hold up the auction process waiting because I'm concerned that it will take forever.
Well, how can you auction off something you don't know anything about?
Well, we know, we're going to auction off spectrum that
But don't you want to know how efficiently it's being used, by whom, and what bands aren't yet deployed, and how long until, wouldn't you want to know that?
So, Congressman, when I advise our management, I give them a presentation once a quarter or once every 2 quarters on new spectrum bands, what they're being used for, what the likely time period would be for an auction. So I think those facts are known. What isn't known is there are hundreds of thousands of FCC licensees across a whole range of services, ranging from private radio services, trucking companies, taxi cab companies, and we should find out if they're using the spectrum on an ongoing basis, and if they're not, let's get it back. Totally agree with you about that.
Okay. Mr. Feld?
Yeah, just to clarify, because of the properties of the broadcast bands, it's pretty easy to say getting more of this stuff out there for use for a number of different uses is a good thing. I don't need an inventory to tell me I'd love some of that stuff. The inventory, however, is extremely useful both on saying where else is there useful spectrum and where are the other services that are in the band, which aren't just the unlicensed, it's also wireless microphones, low-powered television, translators, a whole bunch of things. Where are those going to land if we start to repack the band? So don't need it to tell me I want more spectrum out there, but I do need it for spectrum planning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Stearns. Now we'll go to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I believe the FCC should have the flexibility to structure and conduct incentive auctions. Dr. Conley, you stressed in your testimony that the FCC must have a great deal of flexibility to design and implement incentive auctions. In granting FCC this new authority, how should Congress balance the need for FCC flexibility while providing some legislative certainty to ensure that there is enough participation from existing licensees to ensure successful auctions, and these auctions would bring about the maximum value and public interest benefits for our consumers?
It's a very interesting question. I'm not sure that there is anything that Congress could do to guarantee that people will come to the table. They will come to the table if it's in their incentive, and I think that that is why the FCC should be allowed to have these incentive auctions. I can't imagine that putting restrictions on the auction would somehow increase the interest in selling off or being willing to vacate certain spectrum. I think if anything it would decrease it. So I cannot imagine what Congress could put in there that would somehow increase the desire of the broadcasters to sell these rights.
So you're essentially saying that the marketplace will take care of this, and that therefore, even though we have oversight, that you believe we should be a light touch, some principles, and that's it?
Yes, but moreover, I think that if the goal is to make sure that the auction is as efficient as possible, any touches are going to make it less efficient.
But could you balance out, though, the value as far as dollar value plus the public interest?
I think what would maximize the dollar value is also what maximizes the public interest in this case. Now, there are trade-offs. For example, when it is decided what are the bids that win on both sides, the revenue is based on the different demand curves, how much supply and how much demand. They're not going to choose a price that clears everything 100%.
Right.
Right? So that is a decision which will affect how much megahertz is repurposed, and it will also affect how much revenue is given to the government. So that will be a call. To the extent that they have a target of 120 megahertz, I think that gives a certain amount of a restriction there in terms of how far they are likely to go. But I have had enough experience with auctions to see that, you know, anytime additional conditions are put on there, there are very strong consequences, and I'd say D-Block is a very good example of that.
Okay, thank you. President Obama set out a plan to create a wireless innovation fund of $3 billion funded through spectrum proceeds, which would go towards research and development of emerging wireless technologies and applications. This question is from Mr. Gutmann McCabe and Mr. Brenner. We all know that R&D is essential to keeping America competitive. In the context of spectrum, what does this mean for your industry and its ability to develop the next wireless technologies and applications?
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman. CTI has a large number of members who invest billions, if not tens of billions of dollars each year, and Mr. Brenner will talk a little bit about his company who is a member. We tend to try to do our best to facilitate that in the private sector, and we believe there are probably two ways that Congress could significantly help that. One is the purpose of this hearing today, to talk about getting more spectrum to market and funding the network infrastructure such that people want to feel comfortable putting R&D dollars to work. The second is, and it's something that's been proposed by you and Ranking Member Eshoo and Congressman Stearns, and that's taking the R&D tax credit and making it permanent, providing the ability for companies like Qualcomm and others to say, hey, we've got a future that we understand that makes sense, and we're not revisiting this every couple years. And for us, that sort of making that tax credit permanent will provide a heck of an incentive for our industry. The last thing I would add, which we've just discovered recently at CTI, is we talk a lot about R&D within the United States, and I think we focus on U.S. companies, which is key and important, companies like Qualcomm. But what we've learned is because we've become the hub, the epicenter of wireless, whether it's the apps world or the network world or the device world, we're finding foreign companies are moving their R&D facilities here into the United States. And we're finding more and more foreign-based companies with their R&D facilities in California, in Texas, and in other states. And we think that's because we have the right ecosystem to facilitate that.
Great. I'm sorry, Ms. Brown, I'm out of time, but a quick comment from you.
Well, research and development is synonymous with Qualcomm. As I said in my testimony, we spend $2 billion every year on research and development, about over 20 cents of every dollar that we make in revenue. So we are constantly researching new technologies. It's essential.
Well, thank you very much, and I know I've really run out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It's all right. We want to get the answers. Thank you, Ms. Matsui. We'll go now to Ms. Blackburn. Thank you for being here, and we'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses, and thank you for your patience. I love hearing you all talk about the innovation, and I'm glad we just touched on the R&D tax credit, because the innovators that I'm talking to in Tennessee, some of them I've been working with for years, because I ran the Tennessee Film, Entertainment, Music, and Interactive Technologies component of our state government at one point in my career, and innovators want that certainty, and regulatory uncertainty right now is just a bear, and they talk about it to us quite a bit. Listening to you all, I would imagine each and every one of you knows somebody who is innovating some new application or attachment for the broadband, and they're waiting to see what is going to happen with spectrum. So let's just say Congress sits on their hands and that nothing is done. So what would be, Mr. Brenner, let me just throw this to you. What do you think would happen if we see this spectrum crunch get worse? Because we know that capacity, demand is outpacing the capacity. And if Congress doesn't free up some of the spectrum for commercial broadband, what do you see that impact being on the economy and on jobs?
It would be an extremely detrimental impact on the economy and jobs, Congresswoman Blackburn. I don't think that the world is going to end tomorrow or the next day, but I think the FCC and the broadband plan did a very good job of laying out short-term, medium-term, and long-term steps, and I think that they have pretty much proven in their white paper that by 2014 we are going to have a serious problem. What could happen? We could have basically the effect of brownouts. Your devices won't work all the time. Your devices won't work wherever you go. That's obviously a problem today. The carriers are spending a fortune, billions of dollars every year we almost take for granted to provide better service and better coverage. We're spending, as I say, billions of dollars inventing more technologies. That whole ecosystem will slow down and will ultimately stop. And then also from an international point of view, I was in Canada yesterday. We're actually ahead of the Canadians, which we weren't 2 years ago. We're ahead of the Europeans with our mobile systems and the Asians, and we won't be if we don't have enough licensed spectrum coming online.
You know, I find it so interesting when you equate it to the brownouts because so many of our entertainment industry innovators in the spectrum have become financial service innovators and healthcare delivery system innovators, and we're seeing a tremendous amount of parallels, if you will, in those industries, and I know that that is something they bring forward to us all the time, is wanting the certainty of the availability of that spectrum. Mr. Goodman.
Yes, Congresswoman, I would point you to an article, a kind of timely article in the Wall Street Journal this week that talked about India and the impact of not bringing enough spectrum has had on the Indian market. I think we all think of India as a really rapidly emerging market. And yet in the last 2 years, because of the failure to bring additional spectrum to market, their capital expenditures have gone down 42%. And they said that by 2015, they will not be able to serve a third of their mobile broadband customers, which could have a 1% impact on Indian GDP. And the article ties it directly to not bringing spectrum and not allowing these companies to really to move forward. Okay. And that's a macro level, but I think it's illustrative.
Okay, Mr. Ellis.
I do not think it's a spectrum problem. I think it's an architecture problem. You know, the one-to-one architecture of the wireless industry, you know, is always going to have a problem, no matter how much spectrum. If eventually they do run out of spectrum, either because they don't get it now or they don't get the next slug they're going to need later, the solution to this is a partnership between broadcasters and wireless. We have a very efficient methodology for delivering, you know, high-content video. They have a very inefficient methodology. The two of us could work some great things together.
Okay. Dr. Connolly, I've got just 30 seconds left. You have talked around the issue of the auctions, the incentive auctions, and I agree with your comment about the D block. We put so many restrictions on that. By the time the FCC finished, nobody wanted it. I mean, it's lying fallow. So in your perfect world, what would those conditions for a spectrum auction be to see revenue to the Treasury and then affordability to the private sector so that innovation is carried forward on the spectrum? So you were designing it. What would you say it needed to be?
I would not put conditions.
No conditions.
That's my personal.
Okay. And I appreciate that because that's what we need to hear, because that's what we want to do. I think we all agree that in a 21st century economy, making certain that the creative economy has the space in which to work and expand, and knowing that what you all are sitting here talking about and representing today touches every economic sector in this country. When you look at my district in Tennessee, the efficiencies that have been derived for small business manufacturing primarily have come through looking at the advances that have taken place around spectrum. The auto industry, the entertainment industry, the healthcare industry, the financial services industry, the defense technologies, the list goes on and on and on. So I appreciate that, and I'm over my time, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Now go to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have only a few minutes to ask questions, so I'm going to ask questions of all the panelists. And if you could respond by a yes or a no, and then I have a second question I would like to ask you also. The FCC's record on auctions as it relates to minority, women, and small business success has left much to be desired. In fact, that record led former FCC Commissioner Adelstein to conclude that auction results have been appalling in terms of gains that minority, women, and rural carrier-owned businesses have made as wireless licensees. During the AWS 3 auctions, for example, large incumbents with deep pockets walked away with almost 70% of the licenses. Can the FCC design incentive auctions in a way using benefit credits or other mechanisms to increase these appalling numbers and indemnify broadcasters who relocate? A simple yes or no. Beginning with Mr. Scherz.
That is a complicated question. I think you will see less diversity in terms of ownership, and I think you will also see, I think you will see as a part of the repacking, the Hispanic community, 1 in 3 watches television over the air, so viewers will be hurt.
You can't give me a yes or no?
I'll go with yes.
Yes. Mr. Ellis?
Was the question, can they design it so it?
Yes.
Yes.
I think that's possible, and Congressman, I don't know if you saw this morning, but a letter came in from the NAACP and Rainbow Push and a number of Hispanic groups, all supporting 10 organizations in total supporting incentive auctions. So,
Dr. Connolly?
May I ask clarification? You're asking, can it be done to help diversity among licensees or among help those who are receiving the services?
Licensees. They have to expand the pool of licensees.
It can be done, but it can be done very poorly, and we've had evidence of that before.
Okay, can it be done better?
I would argue that it is scale matters here. Scale matters here. I don't know that that should be the goal.
No, but so you can't give me a yes or no. Yes, Mr.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think Dr. Connolly's point, which I think is a fair one, is this is a very capital-intensive business, the wireless business. So access to capital is a huge determinant in who can bid in an auction and who can win. But is it possible?
It can be done.
It can be done.
Yes.
One of the great advantages of the white spaces is that it allows women and minority-owned businesses to get access to spectrum, which is why so many civil rights organizations supported us in the white spaces. But that said, I absolutely agree the FCC can and should do a better job in making sure that women and minority-owned businesses have greater opportunity to win licenses at auction.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this other question here. Can the FCC, in a different matter, design incentive auctions in a way to increase minority, women, rural ownership, and induce enough broadcasters to relocate and also generate sufficient funds to pay for a national public safety network? Yes or no?
I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, you're talking about auction design.
Yes.
I think it's possible, and I think the question about funding a public safety network is going to be one that's hashed out with you and others in this committee, and I think that's a difficult question that's going to take a lot of thought.
It is a possibility to do.
Okay. All right.
Yes, it's possible.
Yes, and they ought to.
All right. Could incentive auctions create additional unintended problems?
Yes, no question about it.
Yes, solvable, but yes.
Not if done properly.
I think they'd be minor relative to potential gain. Well, they would be inconsequential relative to the gains.
I think that they will be a huge success.
I think that they're complicated. We don't know what the best model is, which is why we need to proceed cautiously and give the experts flexibility.
All right. Mr. McKay, give me some examples of some unintended problems that might occur if the incentive auctions.
Well, I think we've talked at length about making sure that we don't try to overly dictate what the FCC can and should do here. I think we've seen that. It's not just the D block. We've seen it with the C block and other bands of spectrum that have been auctioned. So I think that's an unintended consequence for the auction as a whole. I think with regard to broadcasters, I think we just have to be considerate and think through the process and make it something that incentivizes them. It's in our interest on the wireless side for the broadcasters to have an incentive to participate, and that's what we want. We want them to participate. We believe it can be wildly successful, and we believe we can't miss this opportunity. We've seen Germany and the United Kingdom and France and Italy and Spain and South Korea and Japan have all identified spectrum for commercial mobile purposes and are bringing it to market. We can't fall behind.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. You've been very generous with your time.
Thank you, Mr. Rush, for your questions and panelists for their answers. We'll go now to Mr. Latta for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. And to our panel, thanks very much for being here today. And some of the questions, I'd just like to follow up to some of the other members who have already asked today. But if I could, Mr. Gutman, if I could start, we were talking a little bit about the ramifications if there isn't a voluntary auction out there. And you were talking about what happened in India. In this country, how many jobs would be affected, or how many jobs do you predict that wouldn't be created if we didn't have this auction?
Sure. So we've seen numbers between 100 and 200,000 new jobs if we can move forward with incentive auction legislation. And that is sort of direct employment that we looked at and viewed. But I think if you look at sort of what we call the verticals, healthcare and smart grid, intelligent transportation and education and areas like that, you're talking about a ripple effect that is almost immeasurable. And we really do strongly believe, no matter who you look at who's measuring this, that the change that's going to happen in this ecosystem is staggering. 3 years ago, the hottest selling handset was the Motorola Razr. We didn't have application stores. We barely had third generation, certainly not fourth generation. We didn't have tablets. And I think when we looked at a Kleiner-Perkins study, looked at the first 3 quarters after the launch of the iPod, and they went from 0 to 1 million. The first 3 quarters after the launch of the iPhone went from 0 to 4 million. The first 3 quarters of the iPad went from 0 to 14 million. And so we're seeing a ramp up that's almost vertical, and it's almost impossible to put a number on the value and the jobs and the money that will flow to the economy as a whole.
Well, that's going to be my next question. Is there any way to predict what that value would be in dollars?
Well, we've seen numbers that have come out of the administration from Mr. Summers that have said for every dollar that goes in terms of investment, it results in $7 to $10 in increased GDP. And so that's a multiplier that we think is probably a legitimate number. Dr. Connolly might know. She gave me that look. But there clearly is a multiplier effect, and we've seen it measured at $7 to $10 for every dollar in investment that goes in.
I see that Mr. Ellis would like to make a statement on that.
I'm just wondering if anybody's going to hold him to these numbers.
I beg your pardon?
Is anybody going to hold him to these numbers?
Well, every time we see them, they go up, and so I'll say yes. I'll be willing to suggest. I mean, Cisco put out its networking numbers today, and they went up again. And we've got a company here that sells solutions to spectrum problems, saying we need to bring more spectrum to market. If that isn't the greatest illustration that we need some help, I'm not sure what is.
Well, and I know Dr. Conley, I think the chairman had asked initially what that value might be, and you'd thrown out a low end and a high end. Could you say what those are again?
Well, I had the megahertz pop values I was looking at were between 0.03 and $3.86 per megahertz pop. That's purely based on the 700 auction. But if you aggregate that up, that means that based on the 700 megahertz auction, 1 megahertz at the lowest end would generate $9 million, and at the highest end could generate $1 billion, approximately.
Mr. Brenner?
Well, we need to multiply that by
Please turn on your mic.
But we need to multiply that by the number of megahertz that would be auctioned. So if we're auctioning 120 megahertz, Dr. Connolly's high number is tens of billions of dollars, 30, 40, 50 billion dollars in auction revenues. I don't know if that's going to happen, but there's no question that there's huge demand for spectrum, and if there is an auction, there will be people with a lot of money bidding to get more spectrum.
Mr. Schurz?
The 120 megahertz number has been thrown around, and I just want to give a little perspective. That was in the National Broadband Plan, but that plan did not envision Canada or Mexico. And so the amount of spectrum that you will successfully get out of the broadcast spectrum, I would argue is significantly less. There's some issues with the plan, and so yeah, there are a lot of numbers going around, but I just want to make certain that Canada and Mexico do impact spectrum in the United States.
Ms. Feld?
I just want to emphasize we can't know today how many broadcasters will want to participate in voluntary auction. But when we talk about both meeting our spectrum demand and the value that is being contributed to the economy, it's important to consider the value of the unlicensed and the white spaces as well. There are a lot of uses that individually don't take up a lot of bandwidth, are a poor fit with licensed, and when we're thinking about how we're going to meet the spectrum demand and the spectrum crunch, particularly when we're talking about machine-to-machine, smart grid, other uses where it's really not necessarily a good fit with the licensed service, the ability to offload all that traffic to the unlicensed and save the licensed space for the higher bandwidth uses that people are looking at is critical to meeting our spectrum needs.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I see my time has expired and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Ohio and would now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be last, always, because then you guys know you get to go home maybe, unless somebody else shows up. I don't have a whole lot to ask because most of it's already been asked, but to me, in a way, as I'm kind of, really getting to figure this out, it seems like not having the voluntary auctions would kind of be a lose-lose. It really kind of reduces flexibility for everybody, really on all sides of this debate. Let's say we don't move on anything like a voluntary auction. We just keep status quo. Now, I know this has been asked in different ways, but just very briefly, I'll give all six of you a chance just to say, what do you see as the scenario? So, typical Congress, let's say we don't do anything, and we find ourselves where we are now. What's kind of the long-term, I know there was discussion of brownouts, and things like, where do we see this? And we can start over here at my left.
I think there's no question that demand is growing. I will say that we are in smaller markets, and the capacity crunch really does not exist in our markets. So in the smaller and rural markets, it is not a pressing issue. I think what you'll see is great innovation by broadcasters. You're seeing it today. It's 2 years since the digital transition. You'll see more.
About half my stations are in small markets, same answer as Todd. And half of our stations are in major markets, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, New York, Philly corridor. I think if there's no auction, and if we're allowed to do so, we will approach the wireless companies to create partnerships where they can offload some of their high bandwidth content, their broadcasted type content.
So you're seeing potential for partnerships out of that?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. I think there will be partnerships. There are partnerships, but I don't think we should take away from this the notion that the broadcast architecture is a perfect architecture. It is great if you want to watch the Super Bowl when the broadcasters want to deliver the Super Bowl, which I do, and that's one of the times I do. But all of you and all of our customers want their content when they want it. And so whether it's large or small, I disagree strongly with the notion that, some of our most active members on the spectrum issue are our smaller carriers who want wider channels, who want to be able to deliver in rural areas what the large carriers want to deliver in urban areas. They want broad, wide channels to deliver the video content, to deliver the PowerPoints and things like that.
Thank you.
So I strongly urge with all due speed that Congress consider incentive auctions. I don't see.
And it seems like it would be creating kind of a market. As I see it, it creates a market mechanism for broadcasters or anybody really to make a decision which best suits them at that moment. Just kind of in general how it seems. Dr. Conley.
I agree. The incentive auction is, I think, the most expedient way that I see in front of us to achieve something that almost everyone believes has huge value. So not doing it, then you're delaying any gains that your economy could have. And as a broadcaster, I would worry that other mechanisms might be used to get that spectrum that would not be as advantageous to them, which is something the broadcasters, I think, is why that the incentive auction is good for them because they can win from it.
Okay.
So to round out my prior answer where I referred to brownouts, I mean, what's going to happen if Congress doesn't pass the legislation is the folks who do have spectrum are going to continue to face this exploding demand, and they're going to have to ration capacity. They're going to have to assign the bandwidth in some way, and there are only two ways to do it. That is raise prices, and so it just goes to the customers who are willing to pay more, and that's a bad thing for the economy, or there will be this diminution in service. And I don't think there's a third alternative.
Okay, just quickly. Good. There's a fine line between taking a problem seriously and panicking, and I don't think we need to panic here. I do not believe we're going to have significant brownouts if we don't pass legislation, and I believe that we've seen a lot of innovation, we've seen a lot of cleverness that's gone on as people have confronted technical challenges. That's one of the things that actually makes this country innovative and great, is that when we hit things like what looks like a wall on spectrum capacity, we find ways around that. Yeah, we're pretty good at that, aren't we? Cool. We're good at being innovative. That's what's amazing. And I also, just to wrap up, I serve a fairly rural district, and one of the things I'm obviously concerned about is continuing to deploy broadband to those folks that are underserved, just simply by fact that they don't live around a lot of other people. And so, with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his questions. I thank the panelists for their answers, and your testimony has been very helpful to our committee to hear from all of you. I have asked unanimous consent to submit 3 letters to the record: a letter from 112 leading economists, including Dr. Connolly, to President Obama supporting incentive auctions, a letter from 10 groups representing minority interests supporting incentive auctions, and a letter from 33 IT equipment innovators supporting incentive auctions. Without objection, they'll be entered into our record. Again, I thank all of our witnesses today and in the past panels. We intend to tackle this issue head on and in a bipartisan and thoughtful way. And I appreciate your input and that of others in the audience and others watching. We intend to get this right, not only for our country to grow jobs and innovation, but also for public safety to make sure they have an interoperable network taxpayers can afford and that they can always rely upon. So thank you all for your participation. We stand adjourned.